One of the key ingredients of Subnautica's amazing gameplay loop is the sense of thalassophobia it gives the player, or in other words, an intense fear of large bodies of water. It feels like everywhere we go in the game there are massive monsters, creepy sounds, or just an eerie, never-ending abyss to get lost in. What a lot of players don't know though is that potentially the most scary biome of all was actually cut from the game. You see, if we take a look at some of the earliest and least well-known Subnautica concept art revealed by the team years later, there's one small slide that mentions a single-cell landscape, with a couple of notes. This unique biome would have, as the name suggests, consisted of just a single-celled organism of massive proportions, lurking in the dark and taking over an entire zone. Players in their ship would have to move around in complete darkness, while the tentacles from the alien slowly tried to grab onto the ship and pull us into its essence. The music would have consisted of haunting violin screeches and the low and ominous scream of trombones as the player leisurely descended into madness. It's certainly one of the creepiest zones we have heard about in all of Subnautica, but also one I really wish was in the game, as the atmosphere sounds unmatched. As to whether or not this zone will ever actually appear in the games, it remains to be seen, but it's yet another great idea for the eventual sequel we could see. Potentially one of the most tragic, but less well-known stories in all of Subnautica is that of the Sol Transgov ship, the Mercury 2. For those that don't know, Sol is one of the 3 colossal Transgov organizations we know about in Subnautica that hold extensive and massive swaths of space under their regime, with the other 2 being Altera and the Mongolian Independent States. The Solans, though, are a lot different than the other 2 trans governments, as they are characterized by their willingness to free themselves from the worldly desires of endless growth and productivity, and instead are pursuing what would make humanity best at all costs. This is exactly what the Mercury 2's mission was, and why it was in the Ariadne Arms section of the galaxy. The ship was originally rendezvousing with a Mongolian mining interest on a separate planet and convinced them to implement a more harsh mining quota. So essentially, the crew of the Mercury 2 was an army of monk socialists who voted for Bernie, and one of their crew members was also an extremely talented and curious engineer named Elliot. When attempting to leave the system, the ship scanned planet 4546b and discovered ancient alien signatures, unbeknownst to the crew being the precursors. And Elliot was able to convince the captain of the ship, Diana, to stop and take a look at the chance they may find huge riches. But as the ship entered the zone of 4546b, the quarantine enforcement platform cannon shot at them immediately. But miraculously, the crew was able to dodge the original shot from the cannon by deploying all flares at once and also dumping their molten hot water contained in the nuclear reactor core of the engine. This large heat signature confused the quarantine enforcement platform and also showed that the precursor weapons work on heat signatures similar to human technology. Sadly though, the ship on landing needed to refuel and some of the engines were still damaged. So while the crew started to work on repairing the ship, Elliot was sent out to explore and eventually came across an alien SOS signal, which probably is the same signal the player finds from the alien architect Alan in Subnautica Below Zero. Soon after this though, multiple crew of the Mercury 2 were slaughtered by some of the sharks in the area. And even more horrifying, a portion of the crew had begun to contract Kara and were dying and spreading it to others. In a last-ditch effort to save the remaining crew, the ship captain Diana initiated an all-hands-on-deck evacuation, skipping engine check procedures and abandoning all crew infected with Kara with only 2 weeks of supplies. As expected though, as soon as the ship was in the air, the quarantine enforcement platform once again fired, but this time with a direct hit, which sent the ship flying into the ocean where we can find it in-game today, 30 to 100 years later. The last recording we have of the incident was actually a log Diana made of their final moments.
I heard the sound of metal tearing, and for a split second, everything was tinged bright green and unbearably hot. Then I saw daylight, and I was looking down at the ocean and ice. The strongest wind I've ever felt roared in my ears, ripping through the ship. People went flying out the side of the Mercury, so much screaming and chaos. I was lucky. I had just clipped into my seat anchor. Stephanos came out of nowhere, like a malaika, an angel. I felt his rough, calloused hand grasp mine with the gentlest of urgency. It felt like time slowed, he said. I gotcha. Just follow me, Ella. I don't know how, but he used an emergency tether to drag me to the nuclear reactor core, the strongest bulkhead in the ship. We hit the water and everything went black. He's sleeping. I think he might have hit his head. I'm exhausted. The adrenaline has long since worn off and my body aches. I think I might have fractured the rib. I'm gonna shut my eyes for a bit. When I wake up, I'll figure this out.
Where this theory gets really interesting, though, is the name of the actual ship. You see, in Roman mythology, Mercury, or Latin Mercurius, is the god of merchants, but also the god of thieves and tricksters. Could it be that the Mercury 2 always had a mission to explore planet 4546b? After all, their original mission seems like almost a waste of resources they used to get through so many phase gates from the Andromeda galaxy they hail from. This would imply that all major transgov organizations in-game have an interest in the precursor technology, and also would imply that a lot more people have an idea of what's going on 4546b than meets the eye. Maybe some large and powerful shadow governments and entities have a massive interest and stake in the planet that we don't know about, and the conspiracy of the precursors and their involvement with the Kara goes so much deeper than we could ever imagine. I certainly hope so, as it could be a great addition to a new game. One of the aspects about Subnautica that makes it so scary isn't just the leviathans and dark crevices they hide in, but rather the fact that we have so little to actually fight back against them with. As to why this is, it actually all comes down to an in-game event called the Massacre at Obraxis Prime.
Weapons were removed from standard survival blueprints following the massacre on Obraxis Prime. The knife remains the only exception.
The issue with this event, though, is we don't actually know what occurred here. If we take Altera's word for it, it would seem that there was some sort of uprising against a small Altera facility on an unknown planet called Obraxis Prime. But as to the motives of the uprising and what actually happened, we only have wild speculation to go off of. Altera would have had to send in military personnel to quell the uprising citizens, but because they were equipped with weapons in their life pods, they were able to fight back, and it resulted in countless bloody deaths. Another potential and insane theory is that the massacre at Obraxis Prime is all made up. We already know that Altera is an extremely corrupt and lying entity, so it could be that the entire massacre and deaths are all made up in order to make sure none of the Altera research facility have access to weapons, and the off chance they ever do actually try to uprise and rebel. But as to the real reason why we have no weapons in the game, the answer actually stems from an event in our real life. You see, during the Sandy Hook shooting back in December of 2012, Unknown Worlds was on the verge of releasing Natural Selection 2, which was host to a lot of guns and shooting. But because of how saddened lots of the team members were from the Sandy Hook event, they actually decided that their next game was not going to include any weapons at all. And this is the actual and real reason for the lack of underwater firepower in Subnautica. Subnautica's Lost River is host to some of the most ancient and interesting finds in the entire game series, and our long-lost forgotten Leviathan-class organism is no different. Because right outside the laboratory cache lies a massive and million-year-old fossil belonging to a species we have never seen in-game before. The monstrosity sits at just over the length of a sea truck and is sporting a massive set of teeth and spikes on its head, along with 3 similarly shaped eye sockets on each side of its skull. It almost is reminiscent of research specimen Theta in a lot of ways, and actually might even be an organism of the same species, but much older. While at first glance the fossil seems to be just the head of the beast, upon further inspection it becomes clear that the fossil is in fact the entire body, with just a little bit hidden under the sand. The most interesting part about this creature, though, is the implications of its body on its movement. The body is sporting no fins or ways of movement we often see in other aquatic animals, and this is usually an indication that the animal actually moves on the ocean floors. So is it possible that we are looking at a giant carnivorous sea slug that combs the depths of the sea on this planet? An even bigger question arises when we realize that this is the only instance of this type of skull we see in the entire series, where most others we find have multiple renditions. Could this mean that this apex predator actually lives beneath the sand and inside rocks, and burrows around the environment stalking its prey? We know there were similar sorts of animals that were cut from the game originally, but at one point were planned to pop out of different rocks and surfaces to scare the player. It certainly would make sense based on the shape of this creature, and if it were true, it would prove that we have only scratched the surface of what we can find in Subnautica on our adventures so far. While we have all grown to love the home planet of Subnautica's 4546b, with all its weird creatures and underground caves, a lot of players in the community are still wondering what Earth in Subnautica is actually like. We know Subnautica takes place far into the future with faster than light travel, multiple new alien species discovered, and massive organizations that span multiple star systems. But in all of this, there's basically no mention of Earth in any of the game's lore, and considering we play as humans, you would think our natural birthplace in the stars would play a bigger role. Well, the reason for its absence may be more sad than you thought. If we take a look at the radiation suit description in-game, at the very end of the logs there's a tag phrase, "a necessary precaution in a post-MAD world." For those that don't know, MAD is actually an acronym for Mutually Assured Destruction, and was a big talking point during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, when fears of nuclear winter and the end of Earth as we know it were high. Considering we find this phrase on the radiation suit specifically, it seems quite likely that Earth in Subnautica actually fell during an all-out nuclear war. On top of this, in the Cuttlefish PDA entry in-game, at one point it is noted that, as observed in Earth's dolphins before their extinction. This once again lends credence to the idea that Earth has been obliterated, but the most damning evidence of all actually comes from an Altera PDA entry we find in-game as well. During the expansion, Altera supplied arms to all sides, acquiring and housing a vast colonist workforce, and making the transition from manufacturer to corporate state. Altera's threat to cease trade was one of the turning points in the conflict, bringing about the end of hostilities and signing of the Charter. Based on this evidence, it seems clear that the fate of Earth in Subnautica is less than stellar. In fact, I tried to find more evidence of this based on the natural selection lore as well, considering they take place in the same universe, but I wasn't able to find anything. So if any of you guys know anything about that universe, feel free to comment down below.